could start with just, talking about Gabon a little bit for people who may not know just how vital it is to this planet and to a lot of the efforts that people in this room are doing. So I saw there was, Gabon was referred to as the lungs of Africa.
Yes.
And I thought that was a really interesting way to describe it. Can you tell us why you think that is?
Sure, Jen, and thank you for having me. Really great to be in this magnificent Bloomberg building. Talking about Gabon, Gabon is really unique. It's not because I'm from Gabon, it's the reality. Yeah. We have more than 88% of the country is covered by forest. So which means that today we're the most absorbing country in terms of CO2. Our country, the forest cover of Gabon, absorb 140 million tons of carbon every year. And we have a net emission over all the industries, across all the industry, oil and gas, mining, and all those, of 35 million tons. So we have a net sequestration of 105 million tons of carbon every year. Just to give you a sense of magnitude, it's about a fourth of the UK emission that is being absorbed by the Gabonese forest. And that preservation effort didn't start yesterday. We started it 50 years ago, since 1972, that we embarked in the stewardship of the nature. Back in 1998, we put 12% of our landmass, we classified it under protected reserve. So we have 13 national parks across the country. Then we went on in 2010. We banned the export of raw logs. And and you have to bear in mind that before we discovered oil, the timber industry was our highest income earner. But yet we did decide to ban the export of raw log, and we enforced the processing of timber locally. So we were able to move through the value chain and improve the livelihood of the workers. So we moved an industry of $250 million to a $1 billion industry 10 years after.
And you say Gabon is not net zero, it's...
Oh, we passed net zero, we're sub-zero.
Sub-zero.
So while some countries are trying to achieve Paris Agreement and they're committing to reach net zero by 2050, we're committing to never go above zero.
Well, and talk about, because the last time, for people who don't know this, the last time you were on stage with us for a Bloomberg Live event, you had talked about this record issuance that the country was attempting to do with carbon credits. Can you talk about sort of how you got to that stage, why it was that the country felt like this was an important time to issue this?
Yes, and it tied to what I mentioned before. When we started this, we didn't even know that we could make money out of preserving the nature. We just knew that it was the right thing to do to preserve the nature and protect the biodiversity. For instance, we have the largest population of elephant forests in Gabon, more than 70,000 elephant forests. Now, the reality is this protection effort and conservation effort, we've done it on our own budget. So making difficult arbitrage every day between developing our economy or preserving this common good so that we can preserve the ecosystem services for the rest of the world. Obviously, this is a natural asset that has to be monetized somehow. Because in a world where a living tree has less value than a cut tree is not sustainable when we're trying to get as close as possible to 1.5 degree. So last year, we issued 90 million tons of carbon credit, REDD plus certified by the UNFCCC. But unfortunately, the way the market is designed today does not really capture the value of standing forest. And this is a mistake, and this is really the danger that is at stake. If we're not addressing the issue of standing forest or matured forest, we will never achieve the 1.5 degree.
You're saying the carbon credit market is flawed?
Yes, it is. Yeah. Because the way the market is designed today, but it's designed for the bad students. Because we're looking at the flux. We're looking at how well you're improving. But as I mentioned at the beginning, we're already below sub-zero. So if there's only incentive to help countries get to zero, what about the countries that are below zero? But the reality is, if we don't design an instrument for this country, they will go above zero at some point. And the numbers are there. You have about 30 high forest, low deforestation countries in the world. So meaning countries that have more than 50% of the land covered by forest. The past 10 years alone, 5 of them flipped, right? They lost their HFLD status. And it's clear, and you can understand why. When you look at the numbers, since 2007, a bit less than $2 billion of climate finance were directed to HFLD countries. $2 billion can sound a lot, but look at the drivers of deforestation. Last year alone, the global timber industry topped up $1 trillion. When you look at the cattle industry in the States last year was $80 billion. And those are the drivers, and those are the reason why people deforestate. Why do we deforestate, right? Yep. Is to plant crops, to raise cattle, and to cut the timber to sell it. So if we don't equalize this quickly, we will have more and more countries losing the HFLD status. And if we lose these countries, we'll never achieve the 1.5 degrees. So it's important to reduce the emissions, definitely, but it's also important to maintain the base.
So then what would that look like? I mean, what would be the right financial instrument to balance out the carbon credit market for countries like Gabon?
It will be an instrument that allow the money, first of all, that put the right value on that asset, because again, it's an asset. It's an asset that has to be maintained, and an instrument that allows the monetization of it, right? Because the challenge here is not only about conservation and preservation, but it's also how do we induce green growth in those countries? How do we help this country develop a low carbon economy to ensure that they achieve their own SDG goals?
So then what's worked? I mean, we were talking about Paris. Last week, you were in Paris for President Macron's Global Financial Pact, which was in a lot of ways centered around supporting the Global South. Was there anything that came of that was maybe positive in the direction that you're talking about things need to be going?
Let's be optimistic, right? Let's be optimistic. Let's see the glass half full. Yep. We've seen great progress in Paris in the conversation and in the awareness, because obviously if you need to solve a problem, you need first to raise the awareness. Okay. And I think the awareness, people are understanding the critical role that the standing forests are playing in stabilizing climate. Second of all, there was a great announcement for our brother country, which is Senegal, with the JETP. I think it was $2.7 billion of commitment. And now that the fact that they reached to that consensus give hope that maybe we can start working on a similar model, but to preserve nature this time around.
So then who initiates that then? And why hasn't that been initiated at this point in time?
Why? I would say that the priority was maybe set on reducing the emissions, right, and not enough awareness on the fact that we need to ensure that the carbon sinks remain carbon sinks. Now I believe this is a conversation that you do have with all the stakeholders. So this is conversation for the next COP, but even before the next COP, this is conversation that we will be continuing on the sideline of the United Nations General Assembly. These are conversations that we'll also be having during the World Bank meetings, where we definitely have to find a way to redesign or reimagine the financial architecture. Right, and we saw, just to bring up President Macron again, he attempted to do this with an announcement that he actually made while he was in Gabon earlier this year. I believe it was 53 million, right, to support those countries that are not able to benefit from carbon credits. Is that a model that you think could work? Should other countries, should other institutions potentially be looking at something like that? Again, you mentioned the number, right? Yeah. And we're really grateful because at least he made that commitment, and he was in Gabon with the President Ali Bongo Ondimba. But the reality is the magnitude is not up to the challenge and the risk at stake. And again, it was about putting together, working on biodiversity credits, which are clearly and really important. But again, what are the real financial mechanisms that will allow transaction with the required scale and speed.
Do you see the market waiting for something like that, willing to sort of invest in that, or is the focus too much? Has it been too much on carbon credits and the hype around that, I think?
It has been, but we've seen movement. We've
Yeah.
seen great progress. We're seeing the New York Stock Exchange working on listing natural asset companies. We're having conversation on debt for nature swap. We're seeing that there's a couple of initiatives around at the moment that really give us hope that we will be able to conclude on a impactful mechanism.
When do you think you'll start actually seeing movement, though?
We're in movement.
Yeah?
Yeah.
You're saying right now?
We are in movement.
Yeah.
We're having this conversation, and we hope we'll get to something concrete within the next meetings before the end of this year.
And you mentioned UNGA, which is happening in New York, and obviously the World Bank meetings. But when we talk about COP, we were talking backstage. Obviously, it's the big convening of a lot of, global leaders, climate experts. What's your hope for that COP? Because it seems like these events happen, and there's a declaration, and then we just keep talking about it. I mean, what is it that you want to see at COP28 this year?
At COP28 this year, like I mentioned, it's really our objective for COP this year is really to found that mechanism, to have the right parties around the table and find a mechanism where we will start monetizing and putting the right value on standing forests, which is really critical. How
will you know, though, if you're heading in the right direction in terms of delivering that message and making sure that the country is benefiting from that?
Okay, it's in two parts. The first part is we're seeing the traction and we're seeing the momentum.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, even between this year and last year, we see how people are more receptive and understand that trying to protect standing forests is not a way to do greenwashing or delaying emission reduction from other countries or corporates. They're really seeing as a complementary element to the whole world achieving 1.5 degree.
Right.
Now, in terms of Gabon, we have already put in our laws, and that's why I was mentioning earlier that it's not only about conservation and preservation, but it's also about how do we create a green growth, right? And as the Sovereign Wealth Fund, we are mandated by the government to monetize that natural capital. And in our finance law, it's already included that not less than 50% of this amount will go back into community empowerment, biodiversity trust fund, and building climate resilient infrastructure for the people of Gabon.